So starting to think about Blake in terms of political and social protest again, we'll look at 3 more poems in this video. Think about some of those key approaches for the AQA syllabus and some of those good terms there that we can try to make use of while we're analysing. Those are the key things that you always want to keep in mind as you are thinking about Blake's poems for this exam, paper 2 of the AQA B syllabus. And that's a list of the themes that have been set so far on the questions in the past. And we're going to apply those themes to the poems as an exercise really in just preparing ourselves for what might come up. So, our first poem would be The Lamb, which you're not going to get a massive amount out of, but it's a good example of a innocence poem which demonstrates Blake's depiction of innocence as something largely pure and untouched by troubles. Our problem would be, how do we make any use out of these in terms of political protest? It doesn't seem to be protesting about anything here. It seems to be buying into a fairly orthodox view of Christian belief. The lamb represents Christ. There's meekness, mildness, gentleness are the essence of Christian virtues. God is a sort of loving presence also in this poem. A child is connected to the lamb. I think what's political here is related to ideas of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that there's this belief that human beings are naturally good, naturally innocent, and that if you kind of allow them to be themselves, that you free them from the limits of society and the constraints of authority, that they will flourish in happiness and joy. And that what happens is that that innocent joy, that lamb-like, childlike sweetness is crushed by the impositions of various lords of limit. So we can see that such a poem seems to be sort of saying, well, why isn't the world like this all the time? Why isn't the world so sweet and innocent and joyful and pleasant and untroubled? And that's a protest in itself. In terms of our previous questions, no escape from constraints. Well, here, this is what it could be like if there were no constraints. But we always have to see these poems in the context of the experience poems that allow us to question whether such a state is ever possible, whether this simple, untroubled joy is ever actually really attainable, beyond the kind of gullible, naive innocence of a child. So that's the other side of innocence, is that although there seems to be pure and simple joy here, that may be only attainable if you ignore or are unaware of, have never really experienced the problems of the world, that you're trapped in that rather childlike view that everything is sweet because you haven't really been made aware of the reality of the world. Parents are not oppressive and controlling in this poem, the second of the questions that was set, but they are in other poems, and so we could sort of say, well, this is what a child could be like and should be like, but when parents get involved and try to control the child, they crush this beautiful innocence. Here, religion is sort of about comfort and joy, as was asked in the third question on the syllabus. There isn't a sense that it is a force of misery, but again, you can use this in contrast to those poems, such as Holy Thursday Experience, or the Chimney Sweeper Experience, or The Little Vagabond, or A Little Boy Lost, where you get the sense that religion is crushing the spirit that here is allowed to thrive. The human spirit has the power to resist, was the fourth question set. Well, it doesn't need to resist here. There's no resistance. It's everything is in harmony. But again, there's a sense that this is not a very realistic depiction of the state of the world. If we think about personal relationships empowering, well, I don't think that would be a relevant question. I think that was a tricky question because a lot of the poems you think, not really sure there's much going on here. Although you could say that here is represented with the lamb and the child, a kind of harmony and innocence that is not achieved in most human relations. There are authority figures that come unkind and lack compassion was the 2023 question. There's no authority figure here. Everything is available to compassion and care. There's no need for compassion. We could bring in maybe the divine image here and that idea that if people weren't suffering, there wouldn't be any need for peace and mercy and pity because nobody would be pitiable. Innocence leads to joy and happiness is what this poem seems to suggest, perhaps. But we're always going to have that certain amount of skepticism that says this is a very partial view of the world. And that we can see that in the structure of the poem as well, if we wanted to look at methods and style. Very simplistic vocabulary, a large proportion of single syllable words and other words that have no complex connotations or complex ideas behind them. Everything is like a child, like nursery rhyme. The lines are relatively short, which highlights the rhyme. It barely rhymes. At places it really just repeats the some of the rhymes are a bit off, you could say. Mild and child good rhymes. What's a name rhyme with? Name as well, and lamb, just repetitions there. So the second stanza doesn't seem to be as neatly rhyming as the first, perhaps. So there may be something in that suggests something slightly off that we need to investigate. But it's really only if we start looking at something like the Tyger next to it that we can really start to get more political. Clearly this is very much the opposite poem, and the key line here obviously is the last line in the penultimate stanza, did he who make the lamb make thee? So here's a depiction of the Tyger as something that was born out of a kind of violent creation in a sort of furnace, people have said it's about Industrial Revolution, although really the furnace is only really like a blacksmith's furnace. And what really there is that sense of fiery violence that created this creature. And the question is, is this force of violent energy really coming from the goodness of God, a good God? How could a good God create such a thing as this? It asks a lot of questions. It doesn't answer them directly. It just seems to say that old problem, really, that old question, how can a good God create a world that's full of so much suffering and unhappiness and evil? So really, politically speaking, this is about a world that's much more complex and that's troubled. It's possible to see the Tyger as a sort of metaphor for the French Revolution, and the French Revolution. By the time these poems were published in the Experience volume, 1794, you're getting this sense that the French Revolution's gone badly wrong, and all that violence has been released without any real gain for anybody. It's entered the period known as the Terror. And so you get perhaps that mixed feeling of a revolutionary like Blake who would want to be in favour of a revolutionary politics that seized power from the privileged and wealthy and gave it to the underprivileged and disadvantaged, potentially alleviating suffering. But it's a dangerous power, and it isn't controllable once it's released, and it seems that it just runs amok and causes incredible suffering and violence that just expands and expands beyond the sort of rather optimistic beginnings. So in this poem, you've got lots of potential here for the idea of constraint is implied for that first question, that this is a force potentially of great constraint. This Tyger brought into the world could devour and destroy us, and not just constrain. There's not much parenting going on here. Religion as a force of misery is again implied in the sense that God seems to have created this terrible world, and it seems like it's almost a punishment upon human beings that we are thrown into this world. The spirit of humanity has the power to resist. Well, is perhaps the Tyger more positively a force of resistance, a force of revolution? No hope for the marginalised. Well, this is not really a poem about the marginalised, is it? But it is a poem about whether there's any hope in the world. I'm not sure there's much in terms of personal relationships here, but authority figures that are unkind. Again, it's like, what kind of violent, forceful figure created this world, and are they, is this God, the essence of a sort of violent creator, and therefore not someone who we can turn to for compassion and support when we need it. Here is the opposite of innocent joy and happiness. This is the sort of troubled, fierce anxiety of real life. The imagery is much more forceful, powerful, varied, rich in dangerous connotations. And so what this poem politically suggests is that the world is complex and troubled and full of all sorts of dangers. We might bring in a poem like a Sick Rose alongside this as, again, just simply an image of the world as a troubled and complicated place. That simple innocence that we saw in the Lamb cannot be sustained. The real world is hiding secrets. The real world has got invisible worms, there's howling storms, and lives are being destroyed in this real world by a sense of something corrupt, something getting inside you and eating away at you that you can't see and you weren't aware it was there, but it's going to sicken you unto death. And so here we've got an image of the world as a place of constraint and oppression, where religion is no hope anyway. Religion offers no hope in this world of the Tyger and the Sick Rose. There's no escape from this. The marginalised will be destroyed. Personal relationships, this one, that question that was set in 22, this one would be very good for, because it does lend itself to the reading of it being about some kind of betrayal, that there's some kind of sexual betrayal going on where a partner has slept with somebody else, and that this is the sickness that's pervading the poem, that's ruining the lives of the two people who were happily together prior to this transgression. And that there's all secrets really behind personal relationships that leave those relationships sort of impossible to sustain. So that question could have drawn you straight into this poem. There's no sense of an authority figure, but there's certainly also no sense of compassion here either. And so there's something you could draw upon there about a world that's full of bleak dangers and threats. There is no innocent joy here. This is a crimson joy, which is more intense than that sweet innocent joy of the Lamb, but also tense with danger and trouble. And that might be the message of both the Tyger and the Sick Rose, that the great pleasures in life bring with them great troubles and torments, and the things that you believe in are not simply attainable without destructive consequences sometimes. So you cannot have a revolution without bloodshed. You cannot change the world without being destructive in some way. You cannot attain your full sort of delight and pleasure and joy in life without perhaps in some way causing problems to you or other people around you. So the world is just dense with complication, is really the message from this poem and from the Tyger. And politically speaking, it's that there isn't a simple solution to any of the problems, that there's all sorts of hidden issues that we have to deal with socially, politically and personally that we cannot evade by simply hoping for the pure and innocent joy of the world of the Lamb. And so together these poems would have been useful for most of the questions that have come up so far.